Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the people who've just joined us. I think we're going to give it a couple of more minutes. Maybe we'll start at around 3 minutes past 1 or 5 minutes past 1, but we'll give it a bit more time for more people to join in. So yeah. Okay. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to everyone that has registered and has joined us for today's webinar titled The State of South Africa's Democracy. So basically, today's webinar is going to be sharing insights from the Afrobarometer and the South African Reconciliation Barometer surveys. More than anything, this webinar is going to be presenting data from these two these two public perception surveys by the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. The surveys were conducted in 2018 and in 2019, and they both reveal that South Africans were largely dissatisfied by how democracy is working in the country. Even the latest Afrobarometer survey across Africa, not just South Africa alone, has also showed that close to 43% of African respondents in Africa indicated that they were not satisfied. They were not satisfied with the way that democracy works in their respective countries. So this is just not a South African issue, but an issue that we're experiencing just across Africa as a whole. Today's webinar seeks to also answer some of the questions such as why are South Africans so frustrated with the way democracy works, and also what can be done by institutions such as the IJR and other organizations who are in this field to sort of restore confidence in democracy. And also we seek to answer in terms of how do high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment sort of also influence public opinion on the state of governance and democracy in South Africa. Today's speakers, we are joined by Dr. Paul Karayuku, who is the Executive Director of the Democracy Development Program, which is also an NPO that is currently based in Durban. We're also joined by Jainisha Patel, who is the Inclusive Economies Project Officer based at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. We also from the Afrobarometer have Dominique Dryding, who is the project leader for the Southern Africa region, also based at the IJR. Mikhail Musa is the project leader for the South African Reconciliation Barometer. He's also based at the IJR. I am Kukuno Njinge, and I also work with the Afrobarometer, and I'm based at the IJR as well. So today, today's presentations will seek to answer some of the questions that I've sort of mentioned, and the speakers will present the findings and also sort of discuss how the introduction of the national lockdown in South Africa has sort of affected public opinion on democracy and in South Africa. Finally, we'll also be examining the trends of public opinion from both the Afrobarometer and the SARB surveys. So participants are also encouraged to ask their questions in the Q&A section. We're also going live on the Facebook page. So if you want to post your questions there, the panelists will be able to answer. So the first person to sort of give us an idea, or rather paint us a picture from of what democracy, perceptions of democracy in South Africa. I'm going to invite Dominique Dryding, who is the Afrobarometer project leader, who's also based at the IJR, to sort of gives us an idea of what the survey is, or rather the data is telling in South Africa from the Afrobarometer. I just need to unmute myself. So good morning, everybody, and thank you again for joining us. My presentation is entitled, Are South Africans Giving Up on Democracy? And I'll be sharing some of the insights from the Round 7 Afrobarometer survey, which was conducted in South Africa in 2018. So just a bit of a brief background on the project. Afrobarometer is a Pan-African research project which started in 1999 with 12 countries and expanded to 36 countries in 2015. The topics of the survey range from democracy and governance to the economy and civil society. And the main aim of the project is to give the public a voice in policy making by producing and disseminating high quality public opinion data. The national partners that we worked with in South Africa were Plus 94 Research and IJR.
The data collection for round 8 has started. It started in 2019, but was suspended due to COVID-19. And we're currently in the process of preparing for fieldwork in countries where it is safe to do so. This is just a visual representation of all the countries that Afrobarometer has worked in since the project's inception. And as you can see, Angola was the most recent addition to the network, and their fieldwork was conducted last year. A brief note on our methodology. In every country that we conduct surveys, a nationally representative sample is used. Respondents are randomly selected, and the sample is distributed across regions and rural and urban areas. Interviews are done face-to-face in the language of the respondent's choice. And for the South African survey, a sample size of 1,800 adult citizens was used, and that yields a margin of error of about 2.3% at a confidence level of 95%. Fieldwork was conducted in August and September 2018. So just before I get into the findings, I just wanted to touch briefly on why I decided to look at this data on democracy 2 years later, 2 years after it was collected. As the lockdown hit, it almost felt like things were falling apart. The country slipped back into an economic recession. The Zondo Commission was ongoing. The removal of the public protector was underway. University protests were underway. SAA and Eskom were in dire straits. And 2019 saw South Africa's lowest voter turnout in its democratic history. I really wanted to know what perceptions were held about democracy prior to the seeming falling apart of things. And what the findings suggest is that South Africa was entering into a democratic recession well before COVID-19 arrived. What I suggest is that part of the reason that this has happened is because democracy has failed to provide both the political goods, such as good governance, and the economic goods, such as poverty reduction and employment, that people expected in the post-apartheid era. So do South Africans still value democracy? Despite being one of only 8 African countries considered free by Freedom House, South Africans are amongst the least supportive of democracy in Africa. South Africans appear less committed to democracy in recent years. And as of 2018, just slightly more than half of South Africans said that they preferred democracy over any other kind of government. Among the 34 countries surveyed between 2016 and 2018, South Africa ranked well below the continental average of 68%, ahead of only Lesotho, Madagascar, Tunisia, and Eswatini. Almost 1 in 5 South Africans said that in some circumstances, a non-democratic government can be preferable, and a quarter said that it makes no difference what kind of system they have. When asked specifically about other non-democratic regimes, majorities of South Africans rejected non-democratic forms of government, such as presidential dictatorships, one-party rule, and military rule. But in each case, the majorities were smaller than the continental averages. Unsurprisingly, apartheid was still the most rejected political system in South Africa. When looking at the data across time, support for democracy has dropped by 10 percentage points since 2015 and by 18 percentage points since 2011, and reached its lowest level since the Afrobarometer first asked this question in 2000 in South Africa. Rejection for military rule also dropped to its lowest level ever recorded. And I think that the generally low rejection rate of military rule might be a result in part of South Africans' relatively infrequent engagement with the SANDF at the time that the survey was conducted. However, since the survey was conducted, the military has been deployed to crime-prone areas in Cape Town and also to assist the police in managing the COVID-19 lockdown. So given the increased public presence and reports of SANDF abuses during their deployment, public attitudes regarding military rule are likely to have evolved since the 2018 survey. It is encouraging to note, though, that while support for democracy has weakened, South Africans still value aspects of democratic governance. 6 out of 10 said elections were the best way to choose leaders. The same majority affirmed that many political parties are needed to ensure that South Africans have real choices in who governs them. But only half said that a government that is accountable is more important than one that can get things done without citizens' input, which was favored by 47% of people. Unfortunately, over time, the picture is a bit less positive. Between 2015 and 2018, the percentage of South Africans who agreed that leaders should be chosen through elections rather than by other means dropped by 16 percentage points, and fewer South Africans endorsed multi-party competition over the same period. So how democratic do South Africans perceive their country to be? In 2018, only 1 in 7 South Africans believed that their country was a full democracy. Twice as many saw the country as a democracy with minor problems, but the most common perception was that South Africa was a democracy with major problems. 1 in 10 respondents went even further, describing it as not a democracy at all. Among the political goods that citizens expect a functioning democracy to deliver are political and civic freedoms, such as freedom of expression, media freedom, and space for the opposition parties and civil society to criticize the government. Survey findings show that many South Africans believe that they have lost ground when it comes to these democratic freedoms. When asked to compare their freedoms to a few years ago, close to 2/3 of South Africans said that they now have less freedom to join any political organization that they want, and a majority said that the freedom of the opposition to function has declined. Furthermore, half of respondents said that they have less freedom to speak freely about politics, the media is less free to investigate and report, and independent organizations are less free to advocate their views and criticize the government. Adding to concerns about limited freedoms, about 2/3 of respondents said that they always or often have to be careful about what they say about politics, about which organizations that they join, and about how they vote. In line with the decreasing support for democracy and mixed assessments of the extent of democracy in the country, fewer than half of South Africans said that they were fairly or very satisfied with the way in which democracy is working. While satisfaction with democracy has fluctuated over time, it has declined steadily since 2011 to its lowest level since Afrobarometer first asked this question in the 2000 survey. One consistent expression of the emphasis that South Africans place on the delivery of economic goods is their willingness to forego democratic elections in exchange for law, order, housing, and jobs. Since Afrobarometer surveys began in South Africa in the year 2000, a majority of respondents have consistently said that they would be willing or very willing to live under a non-elected government or leader who would be able to deliver these goods. In 2018, 62% of respondents agreed.
That sounded pretty nice on my speaker. And then...
We find one piece of evidence for the importance of economic goods when we look at how people's perceptions of the economy parallel their views on democracy over time. Generally speaking, when assessments of the national economy and personal living conditions are relatively positive, so are the assessments of the extent of democracy and people's satisfaction with the way democracy is working. In 2004, all 4 indicators were at peak levels, and within 2 years, all 4 scores dropped by between 7 percentage points and 27 percentage points. They climbed again between 2006 and 2011 before plunging again in 2015 and 2018. Unfortunately, the scope of the Afrobarometer survey does not include the exploration into why certain perceptions are held by South Africans. While I can theorize, more studies need to be conducted to explore why South Africans hold the views on democracy that they do. That being said, survey findings from 2018 suggest that South Africa was entering a democratic recession well before COVID-19, and evidence that dissatisfaction with the system's delivery of both political and economic goods could be contributing to this democratic disillusionment. And the COVID-19 crisis is unlikely to improve matters, as full or partial lockdowns exacerbate economic problems, curtail parliamentary and civil society activities, and create opportunities for potential police and military abuses in enforcing compliance, as well as corruption in tenders related to COVID-19 essentials. While the government's rapid and firm response to the pandemic initially won international praise, it remains to be seen whether democracy as we knew it, or as we envision it, will survive and recover or be realized in the post-COVID era. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dominique. I think for the participants that just joined us, Dominique Driding is the Afrobarometer project leader that is based at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. She was more than anything sharing our research findings from the Afrobarometer that were conducted in South Africa. And I think one thing that's more interesting for me is that what she's presenting to us today is in a much more larger scope in Africa. And I mean, also Freedom House themselves have tracked a significant retreat in political rights, including civil liberties in Africa, and even the overall quality of democracy in Africa. So this is not just a South Africa only issue, but also a continent-wide issue, which is the issue of an overall declining quality of democracy in the continent. So thank you so much, Dominique. For everyone that just joined us, you can still post your questions that you might have on the Q&A section and not on the chat box. And for everyone that is also on Facebook, who can still post your questions there, we'll answer at the end of the presentations. So the next presentation now is going to be by Mikhail Musa. Mikhail is the project leader for the South African Reconciliation Barometer. He's also based at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. The SARB data was collected in 2019, Mikhail, if I'm not mistaken, but also he'll share some findings from his perspective in terms of what are South Africans saying when it comes to democracy and in South Africa. So thank you so much, Mikhail.
Thank you, Gugu. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me. Right, there we go. So as Gugu mentioned, my name is Mikhail. I'm the project leader for the South African Reconciliation Barometer at the IJR. And just for future reference, when I use the term SARB, or when any of us use the term SARB, we are referring to the South African Reconciliation Barometer and not the South African Reserve Bank. So in this presentation, I'm going to go through a few different things, but mostly share public opinion data from the South African Reconciliation Barometer. First, I'm briefly going to explain the methodology of the survey, what it does, why it's useful. Then I'm going to provide a brief definition of democracy. It's one of those terms that we hear a lot of, but people have different understandings of. Then I'm going to look at South Africa's recent experience at national elections as a moment of crisis in democracy, something that we can observe over time. And then I'm going to extrapolate some of the data from the SARB survey to explain why we're seeing this decline at South Africa's elections. And then to kind of reiterate the point that Dominique made using Afrobarometer data to show that democratic participation was in crisis well before COVID-19. And then to kind of reflect on where we are now. And this is the sort of discussion that we'd like to have afterwards, presenting this public opinion data, showing that there was some sort of crisis in participation well before the coronavirus. But how will this play out in the years to come? So that's something that we can speculate on towards the end. But briefly, the survey methodology is relatively similar to the Afrobarometer data, so I won't go into too much detail about it. But the sample size is 2,400 South Africans in all 9 provinces. So this gives us a fairly robust set of data and makes sure that the data is nationally representative. Interviews are conducted face-to-face in different languages, again, to make sure to heighten representativity. And again, we have a 95% confidence level with a 2% margin of error. The data is weighted according to variables such as province, gender, race, age, to make sure we get a representative sample of South Africa's various demographics. And the SARB is conducted every 2 years. So the most recent data was collected in 2019 in July and August. So what is democracy? What is this concept that we're talking about today? Obviously, it's quite a contested term, but just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to provide one of my favorite definitions from Stephen Friedman, who's a political scientist in South Africa. And he says that democracy is a system of popular sovereignty in which the political community governs itself. And I think that's quite an important point, is that it's the exercise of collective power over oneself through the exercise of equal decision-making rights and powers of each of its members. So essentially, we all have to be equal in governing ourselves in order for democracy to exist. Now, if this sounds like quite an ideal situation, it's because this is an ideal definition, and we constantly have to work towards achieving this sort of state. So what can we learn from looking at South Africa's national election results? And again, this is something that is quite well known, but I'd like to point out 3 important trends over time. So this chart shows the number of votes for the 3 major parties we currently have, as well as the number of votes allocated towards unregistered voters. So the first thing that's fairly obvious to many of us is that the ANC wins a lot more votes than any other party. We know this, and it's fairly well established. But something that's interesting is to see that the number of votes actually for the ANC in 2019 is a lot lower than previous times as well, despite there being an increasing population. The second thing to note as well is that as the years go on in each election, we're seeing a larger amount of unregistered voters not participating in elections. So unregistered voters are adult South Africans who are not registered with the IEC to participate in elections. And as we can see, since 1999, we're seeing a steady increase in the amount of unregistered voters. So much so that in 2019, some estimates suggest that the amount of unregistered people stood at around 9 million members, which is nearly as many votes as the ANC received. And the third thing to understand from this chart is that as we see, opposition parties gather relatively little support compared to the ANC. But also we're seeing that the amount of unregistered voters is increasing over time. So we're seeing that people are not necessarily opting to vote for a different party. They're instead just opting out of the electoral process altogether. So why is this significant? Well, if we look at voter turnout, and again, this is the amount of registered voters who are participating in elections, we see that South Africa had relatively high levels of voter turnout around the initial national elections, and it has steadily decreased over time. So again, this is showing that there are more and more people who are registered to vote, but less and less people are turning out at each national election. And another interesting thing to note from this chart as well, this is data from the IEC, is that while people initially didn't turn out to vote at municipal elections or local elections, in more recent years, particularly in 2016, where we saw very competitive elections in major municipalities, we're seeing that voter turnout is actually increasing. So this is something that we could also discuss later on, is perhaps people are less interested or have less faith in the effect of national elections, but are perhaps more interested at local level politics. So are people losing faith in the ballot box? And is democracy forever? Or is it something that we constantly have to work towards in order to ensure that we're seeing a self-governing political community? So this is where the data from the SARB surveys is quite illuminating. It essentially explains why we're seeing voter turnout decline at every major election. And not only is this important for understanding South Africa's elections, but it's also important for understanding how the South African public relates to politics, how they relate to political representation, and how they relate to the representatives who represent them in various legislatures. So another thing that I'd like to highlight is that even though South Africans might be disengaging from electoral processes, I think it's important to understand that politics happens outside of elections as well. So South Africans have a high degree of engagement in politics outside of elections. We see that roughly 54% of respondents in the SARB survey in 2019 reported attending a community get-together, raising an issue collectively as well. And we see that people are engaging at a local level with their community to raise political concerns. So in as much as voter turnout might be decreasing at a national level or in elections, we're still seeing that South Africans are getting together to talk about politics, to discuss local level issues. But if we have to examine perceptions of political participation, so what do South Africans think about their efficacy of participating politically? Do South Africans think that they are able to enact change? We see some quite concerning trends. So the SARB survey poses several statements to the respondents, asking them whether they agree, disagree, or have neutral opinions. And what's represented in this chart is the perception of the share of respondents who agree. So we find that close to half of South Africans at a nationally representative level do not believe that they are well qualified to participate in issues affecting our country, or that they have a good understanding of the issues that are affecting our country. And again, what we're seeing is data from 2015, 2017, and 2019. So we're getting a perception of how public opinion changes over time through the SARB surveys. And we find that the blue bar representing 2019 tends to have the most negative opinions between 2015 and 2017. So again, we're seeing that a small majority of South Africans actually believe that they are less well informed than most people about issues affecting their countries. About 2/3 believe that people like you don't have a say about what political leaders do. And a very large majority of South Africans, particularly in 2019, if you can see the difference compared to 2015 and 2017, believe that those elected to parliament soon lose touch with the people. So there's a major trust deficit between the public and political representatives, and that political leaders and politicians simply don't care what people like them think. So again, what we're seeing here is that these are statements that most South Africans would agree with. And I think this is a very dangerous trend in democracy, something that we can observe over time as well. The next issue, and again, this is linked to the previous slide, is South Africans' perceptions in the efficacy of voting. Now, this speaks directly to the election trends that we've seen in earlier slides. And we find again, if we read out statements to South Africans, this is the share of respondents who agree with these statements. Most South Africans believe that voting is meaningless because no politician can be trusted. Now, again, this is obviously slightly different to, it doesn't necessarily translate into turnout. But again, what we're seeing is that over time, between 2015, 2017, and 2019, over the 3 successive surveys where this question has been asked in the SARB, we're seeing increasingly negative opinions over time. So just as Dominique's data was showing from Afrobarometer, what we're seeing is that these opinions change over time, and in this instance are becoming more and more negative. So again, a majority of South Africans believe that all parties are the same, so they don't think that voting has much point. And again, almost 60% of South Africans believe that their vote does not make a difference. So clearly what we're seeing is a huge disengagement with the efficacy of voting and a lack of trust that voting or participating in elections will yield greater opinions from the South African Republic. So is democracy in crisis? Well, I think the first thing to note is that there is a high degree of local level collective participation. And we're seeing this in community meetings and protests, but these are very much at a localized level. The other issue that we're observing is that there's decreasing confidence in the efficacy of national political participation. So again, in national elections, we know that the turnout is declining. But we're also seeing that there's a decreasing confidence in the efficacy of voting. So people simply don't believe that voting is an effective way to influence the political process. And again, we're not seeing simply less votes for the dominant party and more votes for the opposition. What we're seeing is that people would rather stay away from the voting process altogether than vote for opposition parties. So what is democracy like under lockdown? All of this data I've presented is from July and August 2019, and it feels like a very long time ago. But a lot of things have changed in South Africa's democracy since the pandemic. So we've seen restrictions on public gatherings and of course, mobilization to COVID-19. So even though South Africans participate at a local level politically, this has become more and more difficult because of these restrictions. We've seen a greater presence of security personnel and thousands of arrests under the lockdown as well. And of course, we've seen unilateral decision-making under disaster management regulations. Obviously, some of this is required to act in such an unprecedented circumstance, but we've also seen that there's limited scrutiny or public input on the regulations, on what's happening, and on how people's lives are being governed at the moment. So again, these are all sorts of issues that we're able to discuss now, knowing that democracy was in crisis prior to the pandemic, knowing that people had very little faith in public representatives, and how can we restore this going forward as well? And of course, corruption scandals during the crisis have perhaps dented public confidence as well. So again, democracy in future, I think the local elections next year will be critical. Whether people turn out, whether the turnout will be good, whether it will be bad, whether people will simply disengage from the process altogether, and of course the IEC's management of those elections. And again, I think that we'll see lower level turnout. Again, another increase in more registered voters. So we've seen that steady increase over time, and perhaps less faith in electoral politics. So local level mobilization will become even more important sites for politics as people start to disengage perhaps from national level politics. And that's where I'll end it there.
Perfect.
So,
thank you very much, Mikhail.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. I think one thing that public opinion data, rather the Afrobarometer and the South African Reconciliation Barometer surveys do not do, or rather do not ask, is the question of why. And I think it's much more fitting today that we have both Jainisha and Dr. Paul Kariuku to sort of answer the why and put all those numbers, or rather all this data into context in terms of what is happening in South Africa. So Jainisha is going to be presenting now and speaking more on the socio-economic issues that are related to citizens' perception towards democracy, more than anything answering the question of whether do high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment sort of influence this public opinion perception when it comes to how citizens are supporting democracy, or even perceiving receiving democracy in the country. So Jainisha is the Inclusive Economies Project Officer based at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. So Jainisha, take.
Thank you, Gugu, and hi to everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see my screen, Gugu? Yeah, okay. Thanks so much, and thanks to Mikhail and Dominique for presenting their papers and sharing such important insights into the state of our democracy. I'm going to use my allotted time to unpack how indivisible democracy and inclusive development are. And through this, I put forward a suggestion that restoring democratic participation and trust can be done through pursuing policies that put our country on a growth path of inclusive development. At the minute, we're seeing a lot of buzz around state corruption from both civil society and the media. What we're not seeing and have not yet seen is accountability. And I argue that it is the extractive nature of our democratic institutions that yields a waning enthusiasm for South Africa's democracy. The social contract that exists between the elected government and the people is being undermined by development that is extractive and exclusive. And so let me show you what I mean by that. Over here, we're sort of looking at GDP growth in the blue line, which is a measure that shows us how much the economy is growing or even not growing year on year. And we can't really look at GDP growth alone. We sort of have to look at it alongside how equitable that growth is. And so what you're seeing underneath the GDP growth line is South Africa's severe income inequality crisis. The red part of the graph shows us how much of the income is captured by South Africa's top 1%. The green section of the graph is showing us how much of the economy's income is captured by the top 10%, which is near 70% and one of the highest in the world. And then the purple and peach are showing us what the middle 40% and bottom 50% of income owners are capturing within the economy. And this shows us the need for policy choices that not just focus on growth, but a type of growth that promotes inclusivity. And why do we concern ourselves with equitable growth when we're talking about democracy? Well, in the first instance, equitable growth is a more sustainable type of growth. We've seen throughout history that growth characterized by high inequality is growth that is fragile. When the political and economic elite, what we're seeing in the green and the red on the graph, reinforce an extractive relationship with the rest of society, economic growth happens to be concentrated and the economy becomes more vulnerable to shocks. And let me show you what I mean by that. So again, here we're looking at GDP growth in the green line, but this time it's tracked along the number of incidences of social unrest in South Africa. And that's what you're seeing in the blue bars. And this includes protests, riots, violence against civilians, and battles. We're seeing a negative correlation between growth and social unrest. And this by no means explains in full why we've seen such a huge increase in social unrest. But what the graph does tell us, as we saw in the previous slide, is that growth has not been equitable. Vast majorities of the population do not have savings to rely on. And when the economy is growing, very little of that growth is trickling down to the bottom 50% of income earners. Growth has not allowed South Africans to be less dependent on the government because it's not been equitable. So when there is a shock and the government moves to cut spending on services, the quality of life for most Africans significantly deteriorates. And this is when we see people mobilize. The bottom line is that policy choices need to be more equitable. And for them to be more equitable, they need to be more inclusive. This is from the South African Reconciliation Barometer 2019 survey that Mikhail was speaking into. And it just sort of shows us, where inclusion can be better. And we're seeing that about a third of South Africans feel barred from achieving their goals because of these four factors. So in the first instance, spatial planning, the spatial planning of the apartheid persists under our democracy, and our public transport infrastructure continues to be in a poor state. And because of this, 35% of South Africans cannot make their way to economic hubs to pursue their goals. And then, secondly, we're seeing that networks that carry capital and information are really insulated. And 34% of South Africans feel that they don't have access to the right groups of people or the financial resources or capital that will help them to achieve their goals. And then finally, education. A study that was done by the Center for Development and Enterprise found that previously Black-only schools are up to 3 years behind on key learning milestones that previously white-only schools are keeping up with. And so inclusive development means addressing barriers like these. And we cannot call ourselves a democracy when such high percentages of South Africans continue to be systematically excluded from fulfilling their economic potential. We saw in Dominique's presentation that South Africans are dissatisfied with democracy and how this dissatisfaction is actually increasing year on year. And so what I've done here is broken down some of the particular issues that people are dissatisfied with as they relate to inclusive development. And we see that one way to restore satisfaction for our democracy is to deliver tangible improvements to the lives of citizens. And one way to go about this is to meet the goals that are set out in the National Development Plan. In 2011, what you're seeing in the blue line, the government laid out an extensive plan and extensive promises to promote inclusion, eradicate poverty, and reduce inequality. Our most recent Afrobarometer data point in the red line shows us that citizens are not seeing their government deliver on any of these. In fact, the data point shows us a significant decrease in South Africans who are satisfied with the government's handling of a host of factors that would contribute to inclusive development and the overall satisfaction with democracy. This also further highlights Dominique's finding that those who are happy with their economic circumstances are also satisfied with the state of our democracy. And here we're seeing, again, a negative correlation between trust and satisfaction with development goals. Mikhail has sort of shed light on declining democratic participation and in particular voter turnout. So I don't include that here, but again, there is a negative correlation between sort of trust and voter turnout and the state delivering on development that is promised. Again, this is not an exhaustive relationship, but what we are seeing is that from the 2011 data to the most recent data point, trust in local government has declined by 13.8%. And like Mikhail said, we'll see next year sort of what that means at the local elections. And then on a national level, for the National Assembly, trust has declined by 24%, almost an entire quarter. And I've just sort of put the green trend line there so you can see just how steep the decline in trust has been in less than 10 years. And finally, I want to iterate the importance of pluralism as a mechanism to restore faith in South Africa's democracy. Throughout history and throughout the history of nation states, we've seen that inclusive development takes hold as a result of growing pluralism. And within our democracy, we see over and over a selective consultation on behalf of the state. Our government sees society through the eyes of the elite that it consults, and in doing so, it understands the society. It doesn't understand, the society in which its policies are meant to take hold in. We've seen quite recently and quite clearly how the lockdown that was planned and implemented initially gave absolutely no consideration to the informal sector, which, by the way, makes up 30% of our country's labor force. And the lack of pluralistic consultation here sort of showed itself as food systems collapsed without the informal trader being able to operate under the initial set of lockdown regulations. And so rebuilding faith in South Africa's democracy does hinge on the government's ability to understand society from the viewpoint of the informal trader, from unemployed groups, and a whole lot of other interest groups that might have economic interests that aren't represented. Only with real representative consultations can we get onto a pathway of inclusive development, and one which citizens don't feel unheard or disengaged from our democracy. Mikhail shared that democratic participation is highest at a community level and through collective action. And so it's through these channels that pluralism and broader consultations from the state can actually happen. Elitism and the elite consulting the elite gives us the skewed kind of income distribution that we saw right at the beginning of this presentation. And so if we allow the elite or the few to extract from the many, then we're allowing the few to undermine our democracy and the democratic institutions which they serve us through. And I will end off by reminding you that democracy and inclusive development are indivisible objects for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jainisha. I think also in the interest of time, so we're going to try to keep our presentations a little bit shorter because of load shedding. Most of us, those who are in the panel, are scheduled to be hit by load shedding at exactly 2 p.m. So we are trying to make sure we also get to the questions as quickly as possible. So the next person to present today is going to be Dr. Paul Kariuku, who is the Executive Director of the Democracy Development Program, which is also known as DDP. They are an NPO that is based in Johannesburg. So they do quite a lot of development work and democracy related work on the ground. So it got kind of, his presentation kind of gives much more context and also put these numbers that were presented by the Afrobarometer and the South African Reconciliation Barometer and Jainisha in terms of what is happening on the actual ground, what are citizens saying in the work that they've been doing. So Dr. Paul, it's your turn.
Yes, thank you so much, colleagues, for wonderful presentation and really giving us big context around what we've been seeing over the last couple of years. And to answer the question, what's the state of our democracy? I believe the data really speaks so strongly about what we are seeing in the country, and the trends really realistic, because democracy is not just a conceptual ideal, is a lived reality for most people. And therefore, when the transition that happened in 1994 at the dawn of democracy in the country, the disillusionment that we're seeing that coming through from the data is because the promised goods and the promised good life for all has not been experienced by most people. There are certainly a portion of our citizenry that has experienced it, but the majority have been sidelined. And therefore, the disillusionment around the concept of democracy and what it means for us at this point in time is justified, in my view. However, we cannot stay in the place of disillusionment, because we, the citizens, still have the power to change what we see through the ballot box. And I would like to situate my conversation for the few minutes that I have from that point of view. Yes, there is high levels of disillusionment because of what we've seen and the reasons that have been provided for by my presenters. However, I think it's important that we promote this message that if we do not exercise our vote at the ballot box, nothing will change. There is no savior that will come to save us. We have to save ourselves as citizenry. And the only way to come back to a place of democracy in terms of its principles that we value, such as the rule of law, such as public participation, such as collective governance, and all those nice things that, that form what we call democracy. We, the people, must take our place and be decisive that we cannot watch and we cannot just not do what we're supposed to do. So number one, staying out of voting is to our detriment. However despondent we could be, we must use our vote to bring in the change. Vote out any political party that you think does not present your aspirations. It's within your right as a citizen, and you should do so, because that's why it's a democracy. Secondly, we must recontract with the state, our social contract, because what we have been expecting since the dawn of democracy, majority of citizens have not experienced that. Therefore, the state needs now has been afforded an opportunity, the political leadership has been afforded an opportunity to recontract with its citizens and decide what's most important. Is it citizens first or political interests? And that's a question that is making our democracy to become fragile by the day. As more and more citizens observe what's happening and they become despondent because the public representatives that they elected and gave them the opportunity to run the state affairs in their interest have not delivered on what they were promised. And therefore, what we're now creating, we are creating a situation where we can even increase probabilities of anarchy in society. And in most cases, it has also been predicted that if nothing happens soonest in terms of bringing back the aspirations, we could be mobilizing towards a social revolution with high levels of inequality, high levels of unemployment, and chronic poverty that should have been solved over time. These things are creating something that is going to destroy our nation if we don't do so. But there is still hope. And the hope lies with each and every one of us as citizens to make what we think and believe democracy is. Collective governance based on the rule of law and strict adherence to our vision. As a nation, we are not a country without a vision. What we have done, we have deviated from our vision. We wanted and we still desire to build a nation that is respected, a nation that is known for observing its rule of law, good governance, and accountable to its citizens. Those have been the founding principles of our democracy. But over time, we have morphed from a democracy that was espoused by our founding fathers and mothers to what now we are seeing, a leadership, political leadership that is more self-centered and has left majority of us outside there in the periphery. No wonder we see those kind of results from the service. It is not a good picture, but it can be changed. For us to make democracy be experienced, it has to be lived. It has to be experienced at the doorstep of a household. And those are the things that we need to work on now, going third. And as I finalize, we need to mitigate against the risk factors that are making our democracy to be fragile. If we continue to entertain maladministration, if we continue to be tolerant to poor performance, if we continue to encourage career deployment that is more about political interest rather than the interest of the citizenry, we are going to get into a place that it will be so costly for us to turn back as a nation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Kariuki. I think one thing that I'm sort of enjoying from your point is the inclusions of citizens when it comes to the strengthening of democracy. In the last rounds of surveys in the Afrobarometer wrote pretty much came up with the Pan-Africa Profile, which identifies what we call the dissatisfied Democrats. Basically, these are the people who demand democracy but do not think that they are getting it. And some of the available evidence has shown that democracy is most secure against backsliding if we have a large number of these dissatisfied Democrats in Africa, not just in South Africa alone. And I think if we only have 15% of those people, as the survey suggests, we still have quite a long road in Africa when it comes to strengthening and defending democracy from backsliding. So I sort of enjoy that point of inclusion of citizens when it comes to these. So if we're going to answer some of the questions that we received in the last few minutes that we have, most of them are directed to you, Mikhail. First question is, does the South African Reconciliation Barometer take into account spoiled votes and what the increase in spoiling votes means for democracy? So if you can quickly, 1 minute, answer that.
Again, the survey doesn't take into account spoiled votes. So the data was presented from the IEC as well as the SARB. So the SARB is a public opinion survey. So it's not asking people how they voted necessarily. And second, I would be hesitant to read too much into spoiled votes because it's very difficult to determine whether someone spoiled the vote intentionally as a sort of protest or whether they simply made the X too big on the box. Also, we've got more and more first-time voters entering into elections. So these are people who haven't voted before, who perhaps don't know the protocols around voting. So it's difficult to extrapolate too much from what a spoiled vote means, whether it's someone doing it unintentionally or intentionally. And again, the SARB is a public opinion survey, not necessarily an exit poll.
Great. Second question from Justin. He's asking, how do the IJR surveys take changing social conditions into consideration and how it impacts perceptions? So Mikhail, maybe you can give your answer, and Dominique as well.
Okay, I'll go first. I'm not exactly sure what that question means, but I would, provide the answer that we are able to disaggregate the data by very different levels of variables. So income level, SEM, whether people live in urban or rural areas. So we are able to disaggregate public opinion based off people's different social circumstances. And if you are interested in these sorts of presentations that both Dominique and I presented, these are available as full papers. So the SARB data that I presented today is available on the IJR website, and Dominique's paper available as well on the Afrobarometer website. So if you want more details on the methodology around these, but also into what sorts of people are answering the questions and whether there are differences between different groups, those full papers are available online, freely available as well.
Dominique?
Just to add, I was also a bit confused by this question. So the way I interpreted it is that regardless of social conditions, you are still included in the sample. So regardless of where you live, regardless of what area you come from, you still part of the sample and still have a chance of being selected as a participant.
Perfect. Another question is, do you think if we had automatic voter registration that more people participate in elections? Dr. Kariuki, do you want to take that one?
Oh, yeah. I don't think so. We need to ask a question, why do people vote? Yeah. Why do they participate in an election? They participate in an election for many reasons. And one of those is that they particularly identify a political party that they believe will deliver onto their aspirations, what they would want to see if that political party is in power. So having most people to register does not automatically translate to satisfaction. What really translates into satisfaction is the political party of their choice has the credibility to deliver on their aspirations, and it provides a framework that gives them satisfaction at a personal level, that they are heard, they are involved, and that the political party has the capability to promote good governance, accountability, and the rule of law. When those things are ticked off in a voter's personal election checklist, if I call it that way, then you earn their vote. There is no voter who would go and vote for a party that is ultimately going to destroy the foundations of the nation. So encouraging people to vote and to register en masse is to increase the capability of them to exercise their individual choice of a political party that they believe that to form a government that they are happy to support.
Amazing. So we only have like a minute before ESCOM shuts us down. Someone just asked if we can make the presentations available. So Dominic's paper on perceptions of democracy in South Africa by the Afrobarometer, using the Afrobarometer data, is available on the Afrobarometer website. Mikhail's paper is also available using the SARB data on the IJR website. However, both papers will be shared on the IJR Twitter pages and the Afrobarometer pages as well. One last question, public from Sonwabo Sturman. He's asking, public disillusionment with democracy seems to be higher in countries deemed democratic than in non-democratic nations. Do speakers share the same sentiments? Anyone can grab that for the next for a couple of seconds, literally.
I think that the reason that support for democracy is higher in countries that aren't necessarily deemed democratic, because what comes with the idea of democracy, there's a lot that's added to that term, right? So we told, there'll be more freedom to, express yourself. There'll be, increased economic activity, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the things that South Africans have experienced is that prior to our first democratic elections, these were all of the promises that we had as well. And now that democracy is now over 20 years old, we're seeing that some of the things that we link to democracy isn't necessarily immediately realized or realized at all. So, poverty is still really high. Jobs are still really scarce, if not worse than prior to democracy. So I think it's one of those situations where you can only really criticize something that you already have. And if you don't necessarily have that, you still have the aspirations of all of those things that are attached to democracy as well. Yeah. Perfect.
I think I'm going to close it off here, colleagues. But thank you so much to everyone that has attended today's webinar, and thank you to the panelists for joining us and sharing such insightful information. As I mentioned, if you still have more information, you can still reach out to the IJR and engage the panelists on their papers and their presentations. I'm sure they'll be gladly willing to share more information on this. But thank you so much. The papers are online available, which also outline the presentations. We're also going to try to get some insights from Dr. Kariuko and Janish and make them available as well, because they're not in paper format. But thank you so much. Have a great weekend, because it's Thursday. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you.